It was really good for me to meet them because I really admired them from the recording work that they'd done. They're definitely from the same school I come from.
Jimmy Page was born on January 9, 1944, in Middlesex, England, during World War II. His father worked at a plastic factory, and his mother was a secretary for a doctor. They lived a normal middle-class life in the suburbs. Jimmy went to regular schools and had what seemed like an ordinary childhood. Nobody could have predicted that this quiet boy would become one of the most famous guitar players in rock history. Everything changed when Jimmy was 12 years old. He found a Spanish guitar in his family's home on Miles Road. Nobody knew where it came from or who had left it there. But when Jimmy picked it up, something clicked. He became fascinated with Elvis Presley and the guitar players who worked with him, like Scotty Moore and James Burton. He also loved listening to other early rock stars like Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis. Jimmy taught himself how to play guitar by listening to records over and over again. He also read instruction books to learn new techniques. As he got better, he discovered that rock music came from older blues music. He started listening to blues legends like Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and other great musicians who had influenced Elvis. Jimmy realized that Elvis had taken these different musical styles and mixed them together to create something completely new. In April 1958, when Jimmy was only 13, he appeared on a BBC television show called All Your Own. He played with a group called the J.G. Skiffle Group. During the interview, he talked about wanting to become a professional musician when he grew up. He also mentioned that if music didn't work out, he might try to find a cure for cancer. The skiffle style of music was very popular in Britain at that time, and this TV appearance gave Jimmy his first taste of performing for a large audience. As a teenager, Jimmy had to make a difficult choice. His parents wanted him to focus on his studies and maybe pursue a career in science. But Jimmy was becoming more and more interested in music. He studied at Sutton Art College for a while, but he spent most of his time playing guitar in clubs and even on street corners. By 1963, when he was 19 years old, Jimmy decided to dedicate his life completely to music. He admitted that he wasn't sure if he would be successful, but he knew he had to try. By the mid-1960s, Jimmy had become one of London's busiest session guitar players. A session musician is someone who gets hired to play on other people's recordings. Sometimes Jimmy would work on 3 different recording sessions in a single day, 6 days a week. He could play many different styles of music, including rockabilly, blues, and acoustic guitar. He could even play harmonica. Music producers loved working with Jimmy because he could quickly adapt to any style they needed. Other musicians called him Little Jim Page to tell him apart from another guitar player named Big Jim Sullivan. This constant work taught Jimmy everything about how to record and produce music in a studio. These skills would become very important later in his career when he formed Led Zeppelin. Jimmy was often hired as a backup guitar player in case a band's regular guitarist couldn't finish a recording session. He played on early songs by famous bands like The Kinks and The Who, though his name wasn't always credited on the records. For The Who's song I Can't Explain, Pete Townshend was hesitant to let Jimmy play on it, but Jimmy still ended up playing guitar on the B-side song called Bald-Headed Woman. One of Jimmy's most famous session jobs happened in August 1964 when he was just 20 years old. He played guitar during the recording of Shirley Bassey's Goldfinger theme song at Abbey Road Studios. He watched Shirley Bassey perform the entire song perfectly in just to one take, then collapse from exhaustion after holding the final note for so long. This was also the first time Jimmy worked with John Paul Jones, who would later become the bass player in Led Zeppelin. Throughout the 1960s, Jimmy played guitar on many hit songs. He worked on As Tears Go By Marianne Faithfull, Downtown by Petula Clark, and Sunshine Superman by Donovan. He also played on Joe Cocker's version of With a Little Help from My Friends. The session musician world was very secretive. Musicians weren't supposed to talk about which songs they played on, and Jimmy often didn't know which famous artist would walk into the studio until they arrived. In June 1966, Jimmy joined a band called the Yardbirds. At first, they wanted him to play bass guitar, but that didn't last long. Within a few weeks, he was sharing lead guitar duties with Jeff Beck. Having 2 lead guitarists in one band was very unusual at that time, but it created an incredibly powerful sound. Their playing reached its peak on a song called Happenings 10 Years Time Ago, which they recorded in July and September 1966. The two guitars worked together in ways that no other band had tried before. However, the partnership was unpredictable. Jimmy later said that while some concerts were perfect, others fell apart when the two guitarists weren't playing in sync. He would stick to the planned parts while Beck would suddenly change to something completely different. That same year, the Yardbirds appeared in a famous movie called Blow Up, directed by Michelangelo Antonioni. In one scene, Jeff Beck smashes his guitar after an amplifier breaks down, copying Pete Townshend's famous habit of destroying instruments on stage. The Who had actually been offered this movie role first, but turned it down, so the Yardbirds took it instead. Jimmy later remembered how strange it was to see the finished film because they hadn't been invited to any movie premieres and had to wait in line like irregular moviegoers to watch themselves on screen. By 1968, the Yardbirds were exhausted from constant touring. Two of the band members, Jim McCarty and Keith Relf, who had been with the group since 1963, wanted to quit. They were interested in slowing down and playing more acoustic, folk-influenced music, while Jimmy still wanted to push the band toward heavier rock sounds. Their final American shows took place at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles on May 31st and June 1st, followed by performances in Alabama on June 4th and 5th. Before the Yardbirds broke up, Jimmy had dreamed of creating a supergroup. He imagined a band with himself and Jeff Beck on guitars, Keith Moon from The Who on drums, John Entwistle from The Who on bass, and either Steve Winwood or Steve Marriott singing. This wasn't just a fantasy. Jimmy, Beck, and Moon had already played together in 1966 on a recording called Beck's Bolero, which also featured John Paul Jones. But scheduling conflicts, contracts, and personal problems killed the plan. The Who was too busy, Beck wanted to focus on his solo career, and Keith Moon was unpredictable. When this dream band never happened, it pushed Jimmy toward creating Led Zeppelin instead. When McCarty and Relf left the Yardbirds, Jimmy and bass player Chris Dreja still had concerts booked under contract. They couldn't cancel without facing legal problems. Jimmy had to quickly put together a new band and even toured Denmark and Sweden using names like The Yardbirds featuring Jimmy Page. This urgent situation led him to recruit Robert Plant as the singer, John Paul Jones on bass, and John Bonham on drums. On October 25, 1968, the new band played its first official concert as Led Zeppelin at Surrey University. They were paid £175, and Jimmy wrote the amount in his appointment book. It was a small fee for what became a historic night. Robert Plant almost wasn't chosen as the singer. Jimmy's first choice was Terry Reid, a 19-year-old singer that Aretha Franklin had praised as one of only 3 exciting things happening in England, alongside the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. But Reid was already committed to touring with the Rolling Stones in America and didn't want to break that deal. Instead, he recommended Plant and Bonham, a suggestion that changed rock history. Led Zeppelin's early rehearsals took place in a converted boathouse along the Thames River at Pangbourne. Jimmy had bought this property in 1967 for £6,000 using money he had saved from his session musician work. The building had hardwood floors, a view of the river, and perfect acoustics for a band that mixed blues, psychedelic music, and hard rock. It was here that Jimmy first played the guitar riff for Whole Lotta Love to the other band members, creating instant excitement. Robert Plant's life changed dramatically during this time. Before joining Led Zeppelin, he had been homeless for over a year, living out of a suitcase while playing in small local bands around the Midlands. Joining Zeppelin meant going from near poverty to touring Scandinavia and flying internationally within just a few weeks. This huge contrast stayed with Plant throughout his life and later inspired his charity work with homeless organizations. Led Zeppelin's record deal with Atlantic Records on November 11, 1968, changed how the music business worked. At the time they signed the contract, their first album was already completely recorded, so the record company had no creative control over it. This was almost unheard of in those days. The contract gave Jimmy's company, Super Hype Tapes Limited, the right to replace any band member except Jimmy himself. Only Jimmy signed the actual deal. The band received 7.33% of royalties in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, and 5.5% in other countries. Atlantic Records was allowed to release compilation albums, but the band kept complete control over tour dates, album artwork, when albums would be released, and which songs would be released as singles. Led Zeppelin famously refused to release singles at all in many countries, breaking every industry rule about how to promote music. The band also created a unique way of naming their albums using Roman numerals. Their first album came out in January 1969, then Led Zeppelin II in October the same year, Led Zeppelin III in 1970, and the untitled Led Zeppelin IV in November 1971. That last album had no band name or album title on the cover, just 4 mysterious symbols. Atlantic Records hated this idea and warned that it could destroy their career, but Jimmy refused to give them the master tapes until they agreed to his vision. The album became one of the best-selling albums in music history. Jimmy also understood how the rise of FM radio could help their success. AM radio stations only played short songs, but FM stations were starting to play longer pieces and even entire album sides. Jimmy recorded songs that flowed into each other, creating extended listening experiences that worked perfectly with FM radio's format. Their manager Peter Grant sent advance copies of albums to FM stations in cities where they would tour, building excitement before the band arrived. This strategy helped make Stairway to Heaven the most requested song in FM radio history, even though it was never released as a single in the United States. By 1973, Led Zeppelin was breaking attendance records that had previously been held by the Beatles. On May 4th in Atlanta, 49,000 people came to their concert, far more than the Beatles' previous record of 33,000. The next day in Tampa, they drew 57,000 people, beating the Beatles' famous Shea Stadium crowd of 55,000. That Tampa show, earned $239,000, the most money any rock concert had made at that time. In 1977, at the Pontiac Silverdome, they played for 76,000 fans and earned $642,000 in one night, setting a record for a single-act indoor concert. In the recording studio, Jimmy's techniques changed how rock music was made. Instead of placing microphones right in front of amplifiers or putting drums in soundproof rooms, he believed that distance equals depth. He often placed microphones 20 feet away from instruments to capture the natural sound of the room. He also used a technique called reverse echo, where the echo sound came before the main sound by flipping the recording tape. Jimmy changed recording engineers for each album to make it clear that the distinctive Led Zeppelin sound came from his ideas, not from the technical staff. Outside of music, Jimmy developed a deep interest in occult practices and became fascinated with Aleister Crowley, a controversial figure who claimed to practice magic. In 1970, Jimmy bought Boleskine House on the shores of Loch Ness in Scotland, where Crowley had lived from 1899 to 1913. Jimmy also collected Crowley's manuscripts, clothing, and other artifacts. He even had part of Crowley's motto carved into the vinyl groove of Led Zeppelin III. He owned a London mansion called the Tower House, which had long been associated with paranormal stories, and an occult bookstore named after Crowley's journal, The Equinox. Jimmy's interest in Crowley led to a friendship with experimental filmmaker Kenneth Anger. In 1973, Anger performed what he claimed was an exorcism at Boleskine House for Jimmy. Jimmy later allowed Anger to use the basement of his London home to edit a Led Zeppelin concert film while working on Anger's movie, Lucifer Rising. Their friendship ended badly in 1976 when Anger was thrown out of the house after giving unauthorized tours to strangers. Anger then publicly insulted Jimmy and claimed to put a curse on him, saying it would freeze his career and turn his success into something lifeless. Violence also became part of the band's history. On July 23, 1977, at the Day on the Green Festival in Oakland, California, a fight broke out after a festival security worker told manager Peter Grant's 10-year-old son not to remove a sign. Within minutes, John Bonham, Peter Grant, tour manager Richard Cole, and security man John Binden were attacking security guard Jim Downey. Police arrested all 4 men, charging them with battery. Each posted $250 bail, and their arrests were filmed for television news, showing them being led into the police station with coats over their heads. During the 1970s, stories emerged about Jimmy's personal behavior that have remained controversial. Various accounts describe relationships with very young women and destructive behavior during tours that sometimes required intervention from crew members. These stories have been documented in books and interviews over the years, though Jimmy has rarely addressed them publicly. The band faced a series of tragedies in the late 1970s. On August 4, 1975, Robert Plant's family vacation in Rhodes, Greece, turned into disaster when their rental car crashed into a tree. Plant broke his ankle, foot bones, and elbow. His wife Maureen suffered a fractured skull, 4 broken pelvic bones, a shattered leg, and facial cuts. Their son Karak broke his leg, and daughter Carmen broke her wrist. Medical care on the island was inadequate, so a private jet was sent to bring them back to London with doctors on board. This accident forced the cancellation of their American tour, which had already sold 110,000 tickets. On July 26, 1977, Plant's 5-year-old son Karak died suddenly from a stomach virus while the band was touring America. Plant was thousands of miles away when it happened. The grief was so overwhelming that he considered leaving music completely and even applied for a teaching job. He quit using drugs that day and focused on his family. This loss later inspired the song All My Love in 1979. The final blow came on September 25, 1980, when drummer John Bonham died after consuming massive amounts of vodka. He had drunk around 40 shots within 24 hours and choked on his vomit while sleeping at Jimmy's house. Rather than replace him, Led Zeppelin announced on December 4, 1980, that they could not continue as a band. Jimmy later admitted that after losing Bonham, he didn't want to touch a guitar for months. In the years following Led Zeppelin's end, Jimmy struggled to recapture the musical magic he had lost. He formed a band called The Firm in 1985 with Paul Rodgers from Bad Company. But while they produced some good music, it couldn't match the power of Led Zeppelin. In 1984, he briefly joined the Honey Drippers with Robert Plant and others, but they only released one EP. His 1990s project with David Coverdale was constantly compared to his work with Plant, and the chemistry wasn't the same. During this period, Jimmy married Patricia Ecker, a model and waitress from Louisiana whom he met in 1986. They fell in love quickly, and she moved to London with him. In April 1988, their son, James Patrick Page III, was born. The marriage provided Jimmy with some stability, but his musical career remained unsettled. They divorced in January 1995 after nearly 9 years together. When Patricia died in October 2020, Jimmy called her loss tragic and praised their son's strength and intelligence. Jimmy's fascination with the occult continued throughout these years. He had bought Boleskine House, knowing about its supposed haunted history, and Crowley's failed attempts to complete magical rituals there. Stories about supernatural activity at the house dated back centuries. By 1992, Jimmy sold the property, saying it had bad vibes. The house's mysterious reputation continued with later owners. In the 1990s, Jimmy's life took on new meaning through his charitable work in Brazil. His extensive involvement with Task Brazil and Action for Brazil's Children's Trust was so significant that in 2005 he was named an Officer of the Order of the British Empire and became an honorary citizen of Rio de Janeiro. He opened Casa Jimmy, a shelter for homeless youth, and built lasting friendships with Brazilian musicians. When Led Zeppelin reunited for one night on December 10, 2007, at London's O2 Arena, it became one of the biggest events in rock history. Over 20 million people requested tickets online, setting a Guinness World Record. Tickets sold for £125, and all profits went to charity. John Bonham's son Jason took his father's place on drums, creating an emotional moment for both the band and their fans. Jimmy also shared his story in the 2008 documentary It Might Get Loud, alongside The Edge from U2 and Jack White from the White Stripes. More recently, he appeared in the 2025 film Becoming Led Zeppelin, which showed never-before-seen footage from the band's rise in 1969 and 1970, and earned a standing ovation at the Venice Film Festival. In 2014, Jimmy began a relationship with poet Scarlett Sabet, who was 46 years younger than him. They collaborated creatively, producing her 2019 spoken word album, Catalyst. She has described him as her best friend and noted that their life together is quiet and private, away from the spotlight that defined much of his earlier life. Even after all these years, Jimmy's reputation as one of the greatest guitarists in rock history remains solid. Rolling Stone magazine ranked him third in their list of the 100 greatest guitarists in both 2015 and 2023. He has been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, once with the Yardbirds and once with Led Zeppelin. He has also received a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. Through decades of incredible musical success, personal struggles, tragedies, controversies, and reinvention, Jimmy Page's influence on rock music remains unshakable. His innovative guitar playing, recording techniques, and songwriting helped create some of the most powerful and enduring music in rock history. While his personal life has been marked by both triumph and controversy, his musical legacy continues to inspire new generations of musicians and fans around the world.